human monsters. Genene Jones was born on July 13, 1950, in San Antonio, Texas. As soon as she was born, she was placed in the care of social services, pursuant to the objective of putting her up for adoption. She was adopted by Dick and Gladys Jones. She had 3 siblings. Janine grew up in considerable privilege. Her parents were wealthy, affluent to the point that they resided in a mansion that featured a pool, garden, and horses. Certainly not the kind of background a criminal psychologist would expect from the biography of a serial killer. Dick and Gladys owned a nightclub called the Kit Kat Bar and profited from the illegal gambling operation they had going on the side. Eventually, the bar's valuation went into decline, and the Joneses had to earn revenue elsewhere, with Dick starting his own billboard business. Among Janine's fondest memories were riding around town with her father as he erected billboards. Janine was especially close to her younger brother, Travis, who had a learning disability and required special attention. She would love and nurture Travis, expressing the caring side of her nature that she would draw upon in her adulthood as a nurse. Janine did not have such a favorable relationship with her older sister, Lisa, with whom she was in competition. She felt that Lisa was treated better by her parents, though Dick and Gladys made a point of treating all the children equally. Whether it was due to her perceived competition with Lisa or not, Janine had many talents and avocations growing up, and she was no slouch. She was highly intelligent and was skilled in the areas of sewing, playing the piano, and baking, among other areas. One area where she did not excel was in social interaction. For example, at school, she was remembered for being autocratic and aggressive. She was attention-seeking to the point of offending others. Despite all this, if someone made a mean-spirited remark about her, she would burst into tears. She wanted to be the center of attention, but could not tolerate the criticism that arises when the spotlight highlights one's most perceptible flaws. Among her flaws were a tendency to lie and to manipulate others. She claimed to have been bullied at school, but her former alumni insisted it was she who did the bullying. She continued to fight with Lisa, and she got into many heated arguments with her mother because she never shook her belief that Lisa was her favorite daughter. Janine reported that she was bullied at school because her father was well known as a criminal, especially after an alleged attempt at a robbery, for which he was not charged because he convinced police it was a practical joke on which he and his friends collaborated. Janine was also bullied because of her appearance. She was a tall and broadly built girl and not especially pretty. She could have been the star quarterback of a female football team, but as a sexual prospect, her appeal was limited. Not only did she not get many dates, if at all, but she didn't have many friends. Then again, these claims have not all been verified, including the notion that she was abused by Dick. She was a pathological liar, that was certain. Also, being overlooked was painful for her as she yearned to occupy the limelight. When Janine was 16 years old, tragedy struck. It was 1967, and Travis made a pipe bomb. The bomb exploded in his face, and he died on impact. Janine had experienced many hardships, but nothing like this, and she was devastated by the loss. Dick was diagnosed with cancer. He developed the theory that undergoing treatment would only prolong the symptoms. He died soon after Christmas. It was around the time of Dick's death that Gladys began to drink heavily. Perhaps due to the ways in which her life was chaotically upended due to tragedy and dysfunctional behavior at home, that Janine viewed marriage as the cure-all for her problems. She was underage and still in high school, but she was determined to find that escape hatch as soon as possible. She would have needed her mother's approval and signature to be emancipated and placed in the custody of a husband. This, her mother refused to do. It led to even more turmoil in their relationship. 1968. Janine graduated from high school. By then, she had been dating a boy named James Jimmy Harvey. She faked a pregnancy to blackmail him into marrying her. He agreed to tie the knot, and they got married before she admitted that the pregnancy was a ruse. Her mother paid for the wedding, even though she did not approve of her daughter marrying a high school dropout. She not only paid for the wedding and the honeymoon, but she also allowed them to live rent-free on her property. Jimmy's presence in Janine's life could be problematic since he was an alcoholic and prioritized partying over making something of himself. Janine had a passion for racing cars. Jimmy and Janine were constantly fighting, and soon the marriage disintegrated. Jimmy enlisted in the Navy. Meanwhile, Janine became highly promiscuous, sleeping with just about anybody who tickled her fancy, figuratively and literally. She would even sleep with married men and boasted about her exploits. She began telling people that she was sexually abused as a child. It's rare when someone spreads such a rumor about themselves, but she was no ordinary lady. Possibly she may have cited the alleged abuse as the cause of her bed hopping. Gladys fell into a financial hardship and was forced to sell off her land to make ends meet. Janine moved into an apartment but was not financially independent. Gladys was paying her rent. However, Gladys began to put pressure on Janine to think about a career so she could support herself. Eventually, Janine enrolled in beauty school. When Jimmy returned from the service, he worked as a mechanic, as Janine toiled as a beautician in a hospital. 1972. Janine gave birth to her first child, a son. She filed for divorce months later. It was finalized by June. 1976. Janine was pregnant again, this time with a girl. The paternity of this child was unclear. She said that Jimmy may have been the father after a brief reconciliation, but there was another man she cited as a possible candidate. Either way, now that she was a single mother of 2 children, her income as a beautician wasn't going to sustain her financially anymore. In late 1976, Janine's older brother was diagnosed with testicular cancer and died shortly thereafter. Janine developed an obsession with cancer. Every time she fell ill or incurred an injury, no matter how minor, She was off to the hospital to be screened for cancer. She developed a paranoia related to the chemicals she was exposed to at the beauty salon. She feared that all the cancer among her relatives might have portended a future with the disease for herself, even though she was not biologically related to them. Janine persuaded Gladys to pay her way through nursing school so that she could have a safer vocation with which to support herself and her children. During her time working at the hospital, she came to admire the staff, primarily the doctors and nurses. She liked the idea of being the heroine who basks in the spotlight after saving a patient's life. Janine decided to become a licensed vocational nurse, since the position didn't require as much education and training as that of a registered nurse. LVNs also work more closely with doctors than registered nurses. She soon demonstrated an aptitude for the work and subject matter in school. Her behavior was not as highly regarded. She was immature, abrasive, and always seeking to get attention. She made inappropriate jokes and remarks and slacked off on occasion, though she was also highly competitive with the other students. She was awarded her licensed practical nurse certificate in May of 1977. She was hired to work in the intensive care unit of San Antonio Methodist Hospital. About a year later, she was fired by the hospital. The reasons cited were taking an action to which she was not authorized and for being abusive to a patient. Janine found employment at a smaller hospital, a community facility. She resigned in order to undergo a tubal ligation and the subsequent convalescent period. Janine's third position as a nurse was at Bexar County Hospital, later rechristened the University Hospital of San Antonio. Possibly due to a shortage of nurses, she was assigned to the pediatric ICU. The shortage was chalked up to the emotional toll the position takes on the nurses. Many of the children die from injuries or terminal illnesses, and for a highly sensitive person, it can be overwhelming. The first child she treated had been diagnosed with a terminal intestinal dysfunction. Janine fared well enough during the boy's treatment, but when he passed away, she became hysterical. She brought a chair over to the child's containment unit after he died. She stared and cried for most of the day. The RNs caught sight of this and became concerned that Janine would not be able to cope with the steady diet of tragedy that came with the position. They weren't heartless, but one needed to steel themselves against the onset of trauma in order to carry out their duties in that position. They weren't sure Janine was capable of doing so. However, though she struggled to adapt emotionally, her aptitude in medical procedures, like giving injections, was proven to demonstrate a high standard. Janine had an advocate in a nurse named Pat Belko. Pat believed in Janine and defended her, even on an occasion when she came to work drunk and meddled with a child's IV when it wasn't called for. Another advocate was Dr. James Robotham. He was newly hired to oversee the PICU, and one of his objectives was to weed out the nurses he felt were not performing at what he considered to be an acceptable standard. In fact, babies and children were dying in the unit at an all-time high, and he was determined to crack down on nurses who were not carrying out the physician's instructions, especially as they pertained to medication and its application. He liked Janine as she frequently worked overtime and demonstrated personal concern for and devotion to the patients. The other nurses were not quite as fond of Janine. She bragged about her knowledge and skills and would downright insult the other nurses. Ostensibly, she approached interpersonal relations in the workplace like it was professional wrestling, and she was not only a heel, but the world champion. It became harder to defend Janine when she began to do things like defy doctors' orders and administer treatments that she felt were more appropriate given the patient's condition. When confronted, she would argue that she did it in the patient's best interests. Whether it was mendacity or genuine hypochondria, Janine began to approach the hospital's doctors with health conditions she thought she had. She was never diagnosed with any of these issues, but she didn't hesitate to waste the doctor's time while seeking confirmation. She may have had a passion for her work, and her dedication was noble, but Janine made 8 errors in the first 9 months of her employment at Bexar. In some cases, they consisted of refusing a doctor's orders, while in other instances, she would administer excessive dosages of medication. She was required to attend a medical class on drug administration. She was a no-show. Another disconcerting development emerged as Janine became obsessed with individual patients. This often entailed remaining at the hospital for hours after the end of her shift to attend to their needs. No nurse would recommend embarking on a career in that role purely for monetary gain. Receiving care from a nurse who is devoid of empathy and concern for the patients is hardly reassuring to the ailing and wounded. Compassion fatigue is a condition that sometimes arises in nurses who have been exposed to so much suffering among their patients that they reach a point of emotional burnout, whereby they detach themselves emotionally and attend to their duties mechanically with no sense of empathy so that they can avoid suffering in their own right. We want empathy from our healthcare workers, but we also understand that they don't take their jobs home with them psychologically. It's a matter of balance, or as they call it in medical terminology, homeostasis. Emotional homeostasis is the ideal for nurses. Genene Jones was not emotionally homeostatic, not at home and not at work. In fact, on those occasions when Janine remained so long after her shift that she was expressly told to go home, she would refuse to vacate the premises. Normally, complaints were not made about overzealous nurses who worked too many hours, but this behavior of Janine's was getting out of hand. However, whatever reprimands came her way, it did nothing to stop the behavior. You would have thought that the patients were her own children. Certainly, many parents will tell you when they hear about other people's children suffering, it hits home since they know how they would feel if their own offspring experienced the same fate. Still, Genene Jones's children were not sick and dying, so her ability to identify with the parents or the children could not be considered as a verifiable explanation. It was usually particular children with whom she became most emotionally involved, and that involvement extended beyond the mortal coil. There was a protocol the nursing staff followed whenever a child passed away. The child was to be covered with a sheet and taken to the morgue. Genene Jones would not settle for such an impersonal send-off. She would remove all medical equipment from the child's body. She would wash and swaddle them. She would cry hysterically. She would then personally carry the child down to the morgue. She would be talking all the while. It was unclear whether she was talking to herself or to the child's body. Either way, nobody was listening and nobody understood. While some found this unsettling, she was admired by some for being so committed that she worked extra shifts and overtime to make up for the nursing shortage and for forging deep emotional bonds with patients. While the staff were often divided over their opinions regarding Janine's professional conduct, those divisions receded when she began predicting the mortality of her charges with unfailing accuracy. They knew it wasn't a matter of clairvoyancy or scientific acumen. Only a doctor can be so precise, though even their prognoses are sometimes refuted by the occasional medical miracle. Janine made those predictions matter-of-factly, as if they were already yesterday's news. As if that wasn't shocking enough, she always happened to be working when these children passed away. Yes, coincidences and miracles can happen, but never within the rigid framework of routine. There was no scientific method behind Genene Jones's madness. Janine would go out of her way to ensure that she treated the children who were suffering the most. She would even take over patient assignments without approval by the doctors. One day, indulging in some gallows humor, Janine said to a colleague, "One day, they are going to end up calling me Nurse Death." Janine did save many lives, and because of that, Pat Belko and Dr. Robotham continued to defend her whenever they received objections regarding Janine's professional conduct. They accused the complainants of jealousy and deliberate instigation of interpersonal conflict. March 21st, 1981. 15-month-old Christopher James Hogeda perished from a heart attack. Christopher suffered from chronic congenital heart problems since his birth. He was born with a heart defect and was admitted at the age of 15 months because he came down with pneumonia and diarrhea, which were exacerbated by complications of hepatitis and infections. The heart attack was considered suspicious. As with all patient deaths in that unit, Genene Jones was inconsolable when he died. The parents asked her to sit with Christopher until their arrival, and she did. But she also launched into a spiel about how she loved and cared for the child, weeping and attending to his remains in a manner unbecoming to a healthcare professional. She removed the medical equipment, washed his body, ranted and raved about the plight of dead babies, and carried Christopher throughout the facility. Rosemary Cantu was a housekeeper at Bexar County Hospital. Her daughter, Rosemary Vega, had a congenital heart defect and was brought by her mother to the hospital for a procedure called debanding. The surgeon who performed the procedure noted that before it was instigated, Rosemary was, quote, alert and playful. The procedure was successful, and Rosemary was placed in the PICU for her recovery. Her mother frequently worked in the unit, so she was familiar with Genene Jones. Janine assumed care of Rosemary. Before long, Rosemary began to experience respiratory problems. They worsened to the point where she had to be placed on a respirator. Next, Rosemary began to have seizures. Following one doctor's investigation, he discovered that someone had reduced the ventilator's oxygen output. Once the oxygen levels were adjusted to the appropriate level, Rosemary's condition stabilized. She was on the mend. During Janine's next shift, Rosemary experienced 3 cardiac emergencies, which proved to be fatal. If she had survived, she would have had critical brain damage. She was pronounced dead on September 16th. Years later, Rosemary Cantu, reflecting on this incident, made the following statement. "Everything was good. I was sitting by her bed after the surgery. Then Genene Jones came on in the afternoon, and that's when it all happened. She walked in with the injection. I saw her and asked her what was she doing. What are you going to give her?" The other nurse had just left and took all Rosemary's vital signs. She said, "I'm giving her something to help your baby rest." After she walked out, not 2 minutes later, my daughter started turning purple. The monitors went off. People started running. She was doing good until Janine injected her. Then she started getting the code blue. Following these incidents, the doctors concluded that Rosemary's, quote, neurologic status deteriorated to the point of being unresponsive to pain. Rosemary Cantu was faced with a very difficult decision. I had to make the choice, me and my husband, to let her go, because there was nothing more they could do. October 10th, 1981. 6-month-old Jose Antonio Flores was brought into Bexar presenting with fever, vomiting, dehydration, and diarrhea. He was placed in the care of Genene Jones and soon was struck with cardiac arrest. It was not at all what the doctors were expecting. All the symptoms the boy was experiencing were entirely treatable. The doctors were baffled and decided to run some tests to ascertain what led to the boy's rapid and unyielding decline. They ran a brain scan to get a sense of what caused the heart attack. They also inquired about all the needle punctures and wounds. Janine insisted upon taking Jose down to the Diagnostic Imagery Center herself. There, Jose had another heart attack and perished. February 22nd, 1981. 2-year-old Doralia Rios was brought to Bexar. She had some stomach issues, including diarrhea, dehydration, and she was running a fever. She was placed on a fluid IV of saline as a means to rehydrate her. She was also placed on antibiotics to stave off an infection. Not long after Janine carried out the treatments, Doralia had a heart attack and could not be resuscitated. Dr. Robotham became concerned about the uptick in mortality in his unit. It occurred to him that medication that was administered to patients was the cause. One medication in particular was called heparin. It is an anticoagulant drug. Most of the children died from heart attacks, and all the children were bleeding profusely when they perished. Robotham reported this to the facility's administration as part of his inquiry into the matter. He also intended to take a closer look at how medications were handled and distributed. A new policy was put into place. 2 nurses would have to sign a document whenever heparin was to be administered. With a witness present, this would reduce the likelihood that heparin would be abused, misapplied, or pilfered. All children who died from cardiac arrest would be tested for the presence of heparin. This new system yielded the intended results, and the infant mortality rate of the PICU declined. December 27th, 1981. 4-week-old Rolando Santos was admitted. He presented with respiratory issues. He was placed on a ventilator. His condition was stable for a time, but then he had a heart attack 3 days later. He underwent a brain scan and other diagnostic testing, but no cause for his sudden cardiac issues could be detected. January 1st, 1982. Rolando began to bleed profusely from puncture wounds, and his blood pressure fell significantly. An identical incident happened 5 days later. Dr. Ken Copeland was the attending physician at the time. He ordered a test to detect the presence of heparin. January 10th. Rolando once again experienced the same symptoms as he had just days before. Dr. Copeland ordered a test to find heparin in the boy's system, and it turned out that a large dose of the drug had been administered to the boy. Dr. Copeland ordered a medication whose properties reversed the effects of the heparin. January 12th. Dr. Copeland ordered that Rolando be moved out of the PICU, despite his unstable condition. It may have been a risky move, but clearly the child was in danger of being poisoned by remaining in the care of the PICU. Copeland returned to the PICU hours later and was outraged to discover that Rolando had not been transferred. 4 days after Rolando was placed in another unit, his health improved and he was discharged. Though much of the PICU's staff were convinced of Genene Jones's culpability in the matter of the surge in infant mortality, there was no evidence. It is illegal to install surveillance cameras in hospitals due to confidentiality policies, so it would be difficult to catch her in the act. 4-month-old Patrick Zala perished from a heart attack after a successful surgical procedure to repair his pulmonary artery. The death was unexpected by doctors and nurses alike, and the reputation of the hospital was blemished. Nurses became hypervigilant when it came to the dispersal of medications, especially heparin. Dr. Robotham finally became convinced that Genene Jones must have been the executioner. He had no evidence, but there was enough of the proverbial smoke to narrow it down to the fire. She confronted him, and she played the role of victim. When she demanded to know if he believed she was at fault, he confessed that he suspected her. She told him about a, quote, little black book she owned that supposedly contained details of all the infant deaths and the doctors she accused of killing them. She attempted to use these records as blackmail, but there was no credence to this data, and she remained a suspect. She would then take a different approach, trumpeting her dedication and commendations she received throughout the years. That didn't work either. She claimed to be a scapegoat for the failures of others. This didn't get her off the hook. Many of Janine's colleagues among the nursing staff at the PICU began to document and compare incidents of infant mortality that appeared to coincide with Genene Jones's shifts. The data was damning. She was present during over half of the deaths. Between January 1st, 1981 and March 17th, 1982, 43 patients died. They were all assigned to the care of one of 15 nurses, and 22 of them were treated by Genene Jones. She was present at the deaths of 7 patients that were assigned to the care of other nurses. In total, she was working the unit when 29 of the 43 patients perished. This is rare in most hospitals Bexar's size, and the management were now determined to get to the bottom of it. For the hospital, bringing up charges against Genene Jones proved to be tricky. It would not only be difficult to prove her culpability, but if it turned out the deaths were caused by a nurse's incompetence, the institution itself would face charges of criminal negligence. The hospital's board decided to make some changes. One such change was that nobody without an RN license would be able to work in the PICU. The LPNs, other than Janine, were also upset about being transferred to other units in the hospital, since they were all sure it was Genene Jones who was responsible for the deaths. Janine didn't leave without a fight. She would resort to death threats, bullying tactics, and other means to intimidate and harass the staff. There was no payoff for that approach, however, and she resigned. After all, she was left in a work environment that had become hostile toward her. It wasn't just Genene Jones who failed to handle the patients in a responsible manner. Bexar claimed to have simply lost over 9,000 pounds of documents about the treatment of the deceased children. Eventually, they would confess to have discarded the material deliberately. Happenstance was on Janine's side. If all the documents had been located, she would have been charged for a much larger body count. Lady Luck would continue to smile upon the fate of Genene Jones, at least for the time being. In 1982, she applied for a nursing position in the town of Kerrville, Texas. It was a pediatric clinic. Dr. Kathleen Holland contacted Janine's former supervisors at Bexar as part of her background check. She found out that not only had she been employed by Bexar, but doctors and nurses warned her against hiring Janine, notifying her of the crimes of which she was suspected of having committed. Dr. Holland wasn't convinced, and she hired Janine anyway. She even shared her rented home with Janine and her 2 kids. Such was her belief in Janine that she was the ideal candidate for the position. Janine was passionate about her work and very dedicated. They met at Bexar while Holland was serving her residency. She was impressed by Jones and only remembered those attributes for which Janine was once lauded at Bexar. One of the first patients to be treated at Dr. Holland's clinic was 1-year-old Chelsea McClelland. Hers was a premature birth on June 16, 1981, to Patty and Reed McClelland. Due to having been born premature, she had a respiratory condition called hyaline membrane disease, or underdeveloped lungs. She was kept on a respirator during the first few weeks of her life in the NICU, or neonatal intensive care unit. In 21 days, her condition improved enough that she was discharged. Nearly a year later, in May 1982, Chelsea was admitted to the Santa Rosa Hospital for difficulty breathing. Despite being diagnosed with pneumonia, the tests that were run to confirm its presence came up negative. She was discharged, though the physicians warned her parents to keep a close eye on her. They told them to bring her back to the ER if they identified the same symptoms. Patty wanted Chelsea to be treated by a pediatrician since a general practitioner would not possess the in-depth knowledge about pediatric anatomy as someone who had made it their specialty. Chelsea's first appointment at the clinic was on August 24th, 1982. In documentation regarding this visit, there were conflicting reports. Patty told police that she told the receptionist, Gwen Grantner, that she was making the appointment because of common cold symptoms. Gwen told Dr. Holland that Chelsea was brought in because of respiratory distress and her lips turning blue. Patty found this baffling. She had made a point of writing a cause of concern for her baby's health being, quote, bad cold. Dr. Holland called Patty in to discuss Chelsea's condition. During this interview, Chelsea became restless, and she began to toy with objects on Holland's desk and fidgeted in Patty's lap. Janine happened to be present and caught sight of this. She offered to take Chelsea off Patty's hands so she and Dr. Holland could have a more focused conversation. Moments later, Janine summoned Dr. Holland to the room where she took Chelsea. Janine had put an oxygen mask on Chelsea, who was lying on the examination table. In marked contrast to her disposition in Holland's office, Chelsea was now listless and nearly inert. When asked for an explanation, Janine said that they were playing in the reception room when the girl's sudden transformation happened with no external provocation. Dr. Holland installed an IV in the girl's scalp while Janine administered oxygen. As this transpired, Chelsea had seizures. Dr. Holland requested 80 milligrams of an anticonvulsant drug called Dilantin, which was injected into the girl. Holland contacted 911 to get EMTs to transfer Chelsea to an emergency room. Holland informed Patty that Chelsea had the seizures and was being taken to Peterson Memorial Hospital. By the time the ambulance arrived at the hospital, Chelsea was breathing independently. Tests were performed to determine why Chelsea had these seizures and respiratory issues. There were no indicators among the results of what caused it all. After spending a little over a week in the ICU, Chelsea was discharged. Patty and Reed told all friends and family about what wonderful people Dr. Holland and Genene Jones were for saving Chelsea's life. They considered them to be heroines. August 27th, 1982, Nelda Benitez brought her 3-month-old daughter, Brandy, to the clinic. She was concerned because Brandy repeatedly presented with dark and bloody stool. Dr. Holland decided that the child's condition was serious enough to warrant inpatient care, and she had her transferred to Peterson Memorial. Before she placed a call to have her taken there, she told Janine to put Brandy on oxygen and to apply an IV. Brandy had diarrhea, so she was in danger of becoming dehydrated. An IV filled with saline was set up just in case she began to lose fluids. By the time Dr. Holland finished the phone call, Brandy's condition had been compounded. Her skin had turned gray, and her lips were blue. Her breathing was slow and labored. The procedure was upgraded to an emergency transfer. Holland wanted her taken to San Antonio so she could be treated at a pediatric intensive care unit. Brandy was intubated, set up with an IV, connected to monitors, and placed in an ambulance. Brandy's mother rode in the back of the ambulance. Dr. Holland followed in her car. By the time the ambulance left Peterson Memorial, Brandy was breathing of her own volition. Her condition appeared to be stabilizing. However, halfway to San Antonio, Brandy had a heart attack. Janine was in the ambulance, and an EMT would later describe her behavior as very strange and disconcerting. She said she began flailing around and ordering Brandy not to die. She was far more dramatic and emotional compared to the typical nurses EMTs encountered. Janine applied a second IV to Brandy's foot. The EMTs told her they were not equipped in the ambulance to carry out such a procedure. They assumed she brought the equipment with her. They pulled over to the side of the road, and Dr. Holland joined in the effort to resuscitate and stabilize Brandy. The doctors in San Antonio were unable to discern what had caused the cardiac arrest and respiratory failure. August 30th. It was the following day, and 2 patients needed to be transferred from Dr. Holland's clinic. One was 4-month-old Chris Parker. His mother was a nurse, and she was concerned because he presented with a condition called stridor, which consists of noisy breathing. It was due to some kind of partial blockage in his airway. As they awaited their appointment in the waiting room, Genene Jones emerged and came to have a look at Chris. She told his mother that Chris's feet were cyanotic, or turning blue. She brought him to the examination room. Dr. Holland was concerned enough about his condition to have him transferred to the local ER. Janine's conduct while he was still at the clinic was considered odd and unsettling. She stood over Chris, openly musing about the possibility that he could crash at any time, like she anticipated a code blue. 7-year-old James Jimmy Pearson was ailing when he was brought to the clinic. His medical history consisted of a nearly fatal congenital heart condition known as tetralogy of Fallot. He was in rough shape when he was brought into Holland's clinic that morning. His complexion was pale, his limbs were blue, and he was having seizures. Dr. Holland found his condition so serious that she ordered a medevac helicopter to transfer him to San Antonio so he could be treated in intensive care. Both boys were flown to San Antonio, and Genene Jones went with them. The technicians in the chopper found her behavior disconcerting. Though Jimmy Pearson appeared to be stabilizing, Janine panicked and insisted he was having seizures and that his overall condition was on the decline. The diagnostic machines did not show any change in his vital signs. Janine pulled out a syringe and took hold of his IV line. The technicians tried to dissuade her from doing so, but she was headstrong. They noted in their report that she injected the child with a substance without their consent and without reporting what the fluid consisted of. Suddenly a change in his vital signs occurred. He experienced respiratory distress until his breathing stopped entirely. Then his heart stopped beating. The technicians had the pilot land the helicopter in a random field because they urgently needed to intubate Jimmy. The quarters in the helicopter were too cramped to perform the procedure, so they brought the stretcher outdoors. Once they inserted the tube, they brought the stretcher back into the chopper, and it took off without delay. While they were aloft, the tube became detached, and the medical staff had to perform CPR and chest massages while the helicopter made a detour for the nearest emergency room. Chris Parker was taken to Santa Rosa. An investigation was launched to ascertain what happened in the helicopter. Genene Jones was interviewed, and her responses indicated that her mental health may have been compromised to some degree. The official who interviewed her was unclear about whether she was lying to cover up for her motivation to act as she did, or if she truly misdiagnosed the boy out of turn, thereby overstepping her limited authority. She said he was, quote, black, and that she gave him an injection for the purpose of opening up his air passageways. Bizarrely, she also claimed that the paramedics in the chopper suggested she let him die, a violation of their mandate. Naturally, her version of events sharply contradicted those of the pilot and the paramedics. Her histrionic disposition and hyperbolic manner of expression further cast doubt on her credibility. Jimmy survived the incident, but his health never entirely recovered. He perished on October 21st, 1982. His parents initiated litigation in the form of a medical malpractice suit. Dr. Holland had some damning statistics to answer for. In less than a week, she dealt with over double the amount of heart attacks in her patients than she dealt with throughout the course of her entire career. She struggled to find out whether it was a morbid coincidence or if some form of malpractice was afoot. Certainly, she did her job as expected, emphasizing the scientific method over emotion and intuition when analyzing a patient's condition. She could not afford to procrastinate about finding the cause because word had spread throughout the community about the mortality rate of her patients. And while some of them never returned, she also saw a reduction in new patients. Some parents were still pleased with her for curing or saving the life of their children, but their numbers were not enough to save her practice and reputation. September 3rd, 21-month-old Misty Reichenau was brought to Dr. Holland's practice. She presented with a cold whose symptoms were typical in the beginning, with no cause for concern. Eventually her condition worsened and she ran a fever. It continued to progress from there to the point where she had sores in her mouth and refused food and fluids. During her examination, Dr. Holland took a closer look at her neck and found when she tried to bend the girl's head downwards that there was some stiffness and immobility in that area. Holland concluded that the symptoms were consistent with a diagnosis of spinal meningitis. The only way Dr. Holland could confirm the presence of the condition was to perform a spinal tap. In order to perform the procedure, the doctor would have to lie Misty on her side and insert a needle between her vertebrae to extract a sample of her spinal fluid. Should the fluid have a pinkish or reddish hue, the prognosis would be confirmed. This procedure had to be carried out in a hospital. Holland instructed Janine to hook up an IV to Misty. Janine warned Misty's mother, Kay, that children often resist the insertion of an IV and that Misty could fuss or cry. Kay gave her consent to go ahead and do what had to be done. Misty did resist Dr. Holland's actions, but Holland managed to insert the needle anyway. Misty stopped fighting when the fluid from the IV infiltrated her bloodstream, but this did not portend a breakthrough to recovery. Quite the opposite. Not only did Misty become stationary, but her eyes glazed over, and she stopped breathing. Janine's explanation for the latter was that Misty was holding her breath deliberately as a fear-based reaction. Janine forced Kay to leave the room. Hardly a minute passed after Kay's departure when Misty had a seizure. Dr. Holland scrambled to get her intubated so she could get some control over her respiratory system. Inserting the tube into her mouth was challenging, since seizures caused the patient's jaw to close and lock tightly. She requested that the other nurse in the clinic bring her a muscle relaxer to loosen Misty's jaw. Holland would later claim she never asked for it and wouldn't have used it because she was not familiar with the proper dosage. The bottle was placed on a counter nearby. Misty was taken to Sid Peterson Memorial and then flown to San Antonio. Having arrived there, her condition stabilized and the tube was removed. Diagnostic testing did not fathom out the cause of the episode. Subsequent to this incident, Janine told Dr. Holland that a bottle of Anatine, the muscle relaxer that was requested for Misty's care, went missing. Dr. Holland told Janine to search for the bottle throughout the office, but it could not be found. Dr. Holland ordered a new bottle. September 11th, Sid Peterson Memorial Hospital. Genene Jones was a patient. She reported to her attending physician that she had an ulcer. One of her former nursing school alumni, Mary Norris, was working there at the time. When she discovered Janine was on the premises, she went to say hello. As they talked, Janine told her she worked for Dr. Holland's clinic and that she intended to start a PICU at Peterson Memorial. Mary found this strange, since the exiguous population of the town and the hospital weren't big enough to justify building such a unit. Also, Janine, being a licensed practical nurse, would never be considered qualified to run such an operation, let alone get one off the ground. They were on two completely different wavelengths. Mary was the skeptic, while Janine was a woman on a mission. September 17th, 1982. Chelsea McClelland was brought back to Dr. Holland's clinic. The reason for this visit has never been made clear. Janine presented her own diagnosis, stating that Chelsea was having blue spells and seizures. She said the blue spells were increasing in frequency and severity. Dr. Holland gave Chelsea inoculation shots for measles, mumps, rubella, and tetanus. Janine brought the syringes in, which had been prepared by Dr. Holland. Janine injected Chelsea's thigh with the first shot, and the girl immediately began shaking and experiencing respiratory distress. In a book called The Death Shift, Chelsea's mother, Patty, was quoted as saying, "I tried to tell her there was something wrong. She was just insistent about giving her another shot. I said, 'Stop, do something. She's having another seizure.' She said, 'I have to give her this other shot.' I said, 'Stop, do something now.'" Janine's version of the incident, as she related it to the authorities, was that Chelsea was fine after the first injection and only began to experience complications after the second. Chelsea's mother insisted that Chelsea was already in trouble after the first shot. Her breathing was shallow, and she began turning blue as Janine removed the second syringe. As part of her testimony in court, Patty said, "I looked at her, and I could see she was trying to say, 'Mama.' I thought, oh God, she wants to say Mama." Chelsea then went limp, just like a rag doll, just like Raggedy Ann. That's exactly what she looked like, just limp. She was still looking at me, but it didn't look like she could see me. Her eyes were all strange looking, and they weren't like they were supposed to be. Now that they had an emergency on their hands, they contacted EMTs and had Chelsea transferred to Sid Peterson Memorial. Once there, her respiratory system restored its usual course of function, and the renewal of homeostasis was underway. Unable to figure out what had happened to the girl, Dr. Holland had her transferred to Santa Rosa for diagnostic testing. One of the nurses in San Antonio drove Patty McClelland, her son, and Genene Jones back to Dr. Holland's clinic. Patty was talking to her son when she noticed that Janine was filling a bag with medical supplies. Janine had stated prior to this that she needed to return to the clinic to pick up hers and Holland's purses. This was a puzzling explanation since Dr. Holland had her own car and would not need Janine to carry her purse. Janine was packing so many supplies, you would think she was stocking up for the apocalypse. It wasn't the kind of fare you would find in a first aid kit. She took things like tubes, syringes, medication, among other things. At Peterson Memorial, an ambulance arrived, and Janine, a paramedic, and Chelsea McClelland were the passengers. Dr. Holland followed in her car. She had a recurring problem with motion sickness, and, as a result, chose to remain in her own vehicle during such commutes. Patty and Reed McClelland followed the two vehicles to the hospital in San Antonio. During the trip, Chelsea's condition was precarious but stable. She had been connected to an IV, a heart monitor, and a respirator. Janine and the paramedic pumped air into the girl, both taking turns. Suddenly, Chelsea had a heart attack and began flatlining. The ambulance driver pulled over to the side of the road. Dr. Holland rushed into the vehicle to do her utmost to revive the girl. She ordered Janine to administer resuscitative injections consisting of sodium bicarbonate, epinephrine, and calcium chloride. Dr. Holland invested all her effort in performing compressions on the girl's heart. They continued with these actions as the ambulance driver was instructed to drive them to the nearest emergency center. There, Chelsea was still in a precarious condition. More injections and CPR were administered, but it was all in vain. Chelsea was pronounced dead at 1:20 p.m. Dr. Holland went to the waiting room to deliver the bad news to Patty and Reed. Meanwhile, Janine washed Chelsea's body. She removed the tubes. She wrapped and swaddled her in a blanket. She walked to the waiting room and handed the child to Patty. A short time later, Janine reclaimed Chelsea's body and walked toward an ambulance. The three vehicles headed back toward Peterson Memorial, with Janine carrying the baby's body in her arms and weeping at her demise. The official cause of death was documented as cardiac arrest of unknown origin. This report was amended to add a diagnosis of SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome. Hours later at Dr. Holland's office, 5-month-old Jacob Evans was brought in for his postponed appointment after Chelsea McClelland was transferred. He was brought in because of recurring crying jags that had been going on for weeks with no obvious cause. Janine welcomed his mother, Lydia, to the clinic. Janine told her that Dr. Holland ordered blood tests for Jacob. During his examination, Janine made a fuss over his eyes. She kept asking questions about and scrutinizing them. She informed Lydia she would be connecting an IV to him. When Lydia asked why, Janine said it was done as a precaution in the event that he would have seizures. Lydia found all this baffling. Jacob had never had optical issues, nor had he ever had seizures. Janine claimed to have seen movement in his eyes that was typical of children who were susceptible to seizures. Janine said she wanted to prepare him for a transfer. She advised Lydia to stay in the waiting room, insisting it would be difficult for her, as his parent, to watch as his blood was taken. Moments later, Lydia suddenly heard Jacob cry and scream in waves before it suddenly stopped, and a dead silence swept the facility. Janine burst from the room, panicking. She made a phone call and demanded that Dr. Holland be paged. Dr. Holland advised her to send Lydia and Jacob to the hospital, and she would examine him without delay. Having been informed that there was an emergency at her clinic, she drove back there, only to arrive shortly after Jacob was loaded into the ambulance. Dr. Holland asked Janine what happened. Janine told her that Jacob had seizures and that a doctor and nurse from a local office assisted in his resuscitation after he was struck by respiratory distress. She said the doctor ordered 180 milligrams of Dilantin, but she only administered 80 milligrams because 180 would have been excessive. Dr. Holland later recalled that Janine related that last detail with an eye roll. There was never any confirmation that the other doctor issued that instruction, but one thing Janine could always be relied upon to do was besmirch the names of other healthcare professionals. At the hospital, Jacob's condition improved and soon stabilized. Janine was happy to break the good news to his parents. Lydia noted that Janine was sweating profusely and breathing heavily. Her eyes were bulging and wild, like she was exhilarated. Lydia and her husband were nevertheless pleased with Janine, viewing her as the heroine who saved their son's life. Jacob was discharged after 6 days, with no cause for his brush with death having been identified. Dr. John Mangos became the new chairman of the Pediatrics Department of the University Medical Center, formerly the Bexar Hospital. He was placed on a committee comprised of a triumvirate of physicians. Their mandate was to investigate 94 deaths of children that had occurred over a period of 1 year, from 1982 to 1983. Their reports concluded that the common denominator of all the deaths was that they happened during a time when Genene Jones was employed at Bexar, and furthermore, during her shifts. In 1983, the Bexar County District Attorney analyzed the reports, which were frequently referred to as the, quote, Mangos Files. A criminal investigation was underway. The reports were whittled down. 3 of the children profiled were injured and 10 had died. All cases featured unexplained bleeding, seizures, heart attacks, and respiratory failures. The conclusions of these reports offered 3 theories as to why Genene Jones was present at all these events. 1. Coincidence. 2. Jones elected to care for critically ill infants and children. 3. Negligence or substandard performance by Jones, which led to the deaths or downgrade of the overall conditions of patients. As that investigation was wrapping up, Kerrville's Medical Management Board launched an inquiry about similar issues. Though Kathleen Holland's pediatric clinic had been operational for less than a month, there had been 5 emergency transports from the clinic to Sid Peterson Memorial Hospital. Nobody expected such a high volume of urgent outflow of patients in such a short time. It was impossible not to notice, and the committee was greatly concerned. What they found especially perplexing was that most of the children who had been brought to Holland's clinic didn't present with conditions that would warrant an emergency transfer to an ER or PICU. Furthermore, once they were admitted and treated at Peterson Memorial, they recovered shortly thereafter. Atop of all this, all diagnostic testing yielded results that were inconclusive and negative for the proposed causes. Something was making those children gravely ill, but the cause was consistent in its nebulosity. Still, there was a cause, and they needed to check under every rock to narrow it down to a single threat. The staff at Peterson Memorial were frustrated with Dr. Holland and her nurse, Genene Jones. Among their complaints were that Holland and Jones were demanding, condescending, and chaotic. Jones always made sure to boast about her knowledge of pediatric medicine, despite not being a pediatrician herself. She was patronizing to staff and would be dictatorial to them. Aside from Dr. Holland, Genene Jones didn't seem to recognize anybody's authority, not even when her qualifications were overshadowed by theirs by a significant margin. She had been caught in the act of taking notes from other patients' files, in direct violation of patient-physician confidentiality policies. Whenever Holland and Jones entered the facility with an emergency on their hands, theirs was a display of conduct that came across as unprofessional and unconvincing. They were excessively emotional, with their tears and tantrums, operating in panic mode. They shouted and screamed. They demanded tools and other medical materials. They threw objects. It was theater of the absurd in the least appropriate venue imaginable. Indeed, they were conducting themselves more like actresses on a stage than like healthcare professionals in a scientific milieu. However, as much as their comportment in the hospital vexed the Peterson staff, what concerned them above all was the sharp increase in cardiac arrest and close calls in that regard in such a short period during the brief existence of Holland's clinic. The Peterson staff decided this was a matter of considerable concern and one that demanded scrutiny. A committee was formed. Dr. Holland was summoned to meet with the committee so that they could address their concerns and get some answers. The head of the committee was Chief Administrator Tony Hall. Also involved were head nurse of the ICU, Martha Carlson, radiologist Dr. Larry Adams, Chief of Staff Dr. Packard, and Surgeon Dr. Schuster. Additionally, a notice was disseminated making it known that all emergencies in Dr. Holland's office must be carefully observed and monitored by the attending staff at Peterson Memorial so they could get to the bottom of things to account for the sudden rash of emergencies. The first opportunity to do so arose just one day later, on September 23rd. Rolinda Ruff, a 5-month-old, was brought to Holland's clinic by her mother, Clarabelle, for chronic diarrhea. Janine brought Rolinda into the examination room to check her vital signs and hook her up to an IV to dispel the dehydration that had arisen as a complication of the diarrhea. Dr. Holland examined Rolinda's condition and decided to have her transferred to Sid Memorial for observation. While Dr. Holland walked from the waiting room to her office and on toward the examination room, Clarabelle caught sight of Rolinda having an oxygen mask placed over her face while she struggled to breathe. Rolinda hadn't even been completely checked into the clinic, so her entire background and medical history were not fully documented. But now she was being prepared for a commute to a hospital. While diarrhea is a valid area of concern, it is seldom treated as a medical emergency in and of itself. The staff of Peterson Memorial received their latest contact from the Holland Clinic, and it involved a code blue. Naturally, when the patient arrived, she was accompanied by both Genene Jones and Dr. Holland. Their contributions were redundant. Several doctors were already waiting to treat the child. Dr. Frank Bradley was an anesthesiologist, and he observed as Rolinda was wheeled into the emergency room. Accompanying him were Dr. Packard, Dr. Adams, Dr. Johnston, and Dr. Merritt. Rolinda's condition was stabilizing by then, and her color was returning. She was fighting to renew her standard breathing patterns as Dr. Holland tried to intubate her. Dr. Merritt told her this procedure was unnecessary, but Dr. Holland carried it out anyway. Dr. Bradley noticed the child resisted the presence of the tube as she fought to breathe on her own. She would even try to remove the tube herself. Dr. Bradley recognized this scene. Anatine, a muscle relaxer, could produce such a reaction in a patient. It was normally used in surgery. As it makes its way out of the patient's system, their movements will become jerky. Rolinda's attempts to remove the tube were marked by jerking movements. It really did seem that Rolinda was coming down from the effects of Anatine, which was baffling to the anesthesiologist. Dr. Bradley summoned the other doctors and shared his suspicions with them. Dr. Packard went off to find Tony Hall and reported what they had discussed. That afternoon, a committee meeting was held. Following that meeting, Kathleen Holland reported for her appointment with Tony Hall. He told her that the topic for that meeting was her nurse, Genene Jones. He noted that her conduct was unprofessional and inappropriate, and that it was offensive to his staff. He suspected Holland was involved, though he didn't have enough evidence to mention that to her at the time. During the emergency regarding Rolinda Ruff's condition, Janine told Mary Parker, who reported to Holland's office with her son Chris for an appointment, to meet her and Dr. Holland at the ER of Peterson Memorial. Chris presented with an ear infection, but now his condition was upgraded to a state of emergency. It was Genene Jones who concluded that the child was coding. She carried out the chain of events leading to his code blue and the subsequent response. Justification for the code blue was the fact that he was no longer breathing. The staff at Peterson Memorial stabilized his condition before Dr. Holland's arrival. Staff witnessed Dr. Holland's discovery of a syringe by the baby's body that contained some kind of fluid. Holland wanted to know where it came from, but the Peterson staff did not have the answer. She threw it on the floor, and a nurse had to pick it up and get rid of it. Such was the latest show of disrespect to the Peterson staff. Misty Reichenau had been a patient of Dr. Dwan Packard. He was disturbed by the incident involving Misty at Holland's clinic and the sudden spike in the rate of emergencies in Kerrville. He shared his concerns with a surgeon by the name of Dr. Vinus. Dr. Vinus told him he would make some phone calls to find out if anybody at University Health Center could provide them with information to help them get a sense of what was causing the emergencies. A resident who worked at the PICU told him that all the deaths and near deaths of patients in that unit happened to occur while Genene Jones was on the job. September 24th. The committee received word regarding information about Genene Jones and the cases in San Antonio. Dr. Holland was called in for questioning. She was prepared. She had written down every case on an index card, complete with every patient's medical condition, symptoms, and the emergencies. Though the information came across as credible, the fact that all cases happened so closely together and in such small quarters concerned them. They questioned her about the anatine. She acknowledged that she kept a vial of it in her clinic, but insisted she hadn't used any since her residency at Bexar. They asked her about the problems surrounding Genene Jones at University Medical Center. Holland said that the policy changed and LPNs no longer treat the patients in that unit. As the meeting drew to a close, Dr. Holland was paged. Another of her patients was seized by cardiac arrest. Predictably, the patient was being treated by Genene Jones at the time. The Medical Management Board decided it was high time to bring the matters to a higher authority. They contacted the Texas Board of Vocational Nurses. They told investigator Ferris Aldridge what was going on. He said it wasn't an issue for the board. He said a child killer was a criminal matter to be handled by a law enforcement agency. He contacted the Texas Rangers. Investigator Joe Davis was the first officer assigned to the case. After returning from a brief excursion out of town, Dr. Holland met with Janine to discuss with her the meeting she had with Medical Management Board. Janine groused about how people were supposedly making up rumors about her and being troublemakers in the general sense. Janine mentioned that she found the missing bottle of anatine. Dr. Holland didn't mention it because it had slipped her mind. When she asked Janine where she found it, she told her that it was buried underneath some items in the crash cart. She also told her that the top had been popped, which was concerning to Dr. Holland. This means that the plastic cap on the stopper had been removed. Dr. Holland asked if any of it was used. Janine said there were no needle marks, and both the original bottle and its replacement both contained 10 cc's. The fact that Janine broached the subject of the anatine unbidden began to worry Dr. Holland. Also, it wasn't like she hadn't been aware of Janine's strange and unprofessional behavior in the workplace. For one thing, she had witnessed it several times. Additionally, she was warned about Janine when she hired her. Then there were the incidents at Bexar and the frequent emergencies at her own practice. The meetings with the board didn't exactly allay her concerns. Dr. Holland met with Dr. Packard. He advised her that Genene Jones was under investigation. He warned her that if she wanted to avoid being similarly charged, she would need to ensure there were no mistakes or other forms of malpractice at her clinic. Speaking of which, Dr. Holland went to the medicine cabinet while Janine was having her lunch. She had a look at the 2 vials of anatine. The one whose top had been removed bore 2 small punctures in the top. When Janine returned from lunch, Holland asked her about the puncture holes and where the bottle had been. Janine told her that the emergency involving Misty Reichenau had involved Holland requesting the bottle. Neither Holland nor her other nurse, Debbie, were clear on whether Holland had asked for the bottle. The anatine hadn't been used, however, and Holland asked Debbie what had been done with it. Debbie said she had just put it on the counter in the room behind a container of cotton balls, but that she didn't know about the fate of the vial thereafter. Dr. Holland was becoming very uneasy, even paranoid. A bottle of anatine goes missing, then it reappears with puncture marks. So many of the heart attacks and episodes of respiratory distress just happened to transpire as Genene Jones was administering treatment. Even children who were suffering from minor ailments would suddenly experience seizures, heart attacks, and shortness of breath. Though not impossible, it was nevertheless rare for patients suffering from conditions that were easily cured to suddenly be upgraded to critical condition or even death. She had given Genene Jones the benefit of the doubt, but now her trust in the woman was shaken. She had to confront her. The following exchange between the two women took place according to witness testimony. That still doesn't explain the holes. How did the holes get there? How am I going to explain the holes in the bottle? I don't think we should explain them at all. I think we should just throw it out. We thought the bottle was lost. We should say we never found it. Dr. Holland would say later that it was at that moment when she realized just how serious the investigation was, and that Jones likely was the perpetrator. Genene Jones lost her only friend and defender. She was likely to face the music soon. Meanwhile, Dr. Holland was struggling to find a solution to the problem. She had a mentor in Dr. Joe Vinus. She called him to get some advice. Genene Jones's behavior was strange and at times bewildering, a trend with no sign of cessation. Patty McClelland made a trip to the cemetery where her daughter was buried. She was surprised to find Genene Jones at Chelsea's gravestone. Janine was rocking back and forth, moaning and sobbing. She chanted Chelsea's name like it was some kind of tragic mantra, like if she repeated it enough, the girl's spirit might be summoned from the afterlife. Even Patty hadn't been so hysterical at the gravesite. When Janine returned to work, she approached Dr. Holland to inform her she had ingested an overdose of doxepin. Holland knew that Jones had been on a medication for depression, so she didn't question this claim. Jones was becoming more and more somnolent, with the symptoms showing up on her face. She looked like she could pass out at any moment. Dr. Holland went through Janine's purse and found a bottle of that very medication. It was empty. Dr. Holland called 911 and had Janine taken to Peterson Memorial. There, her stomach was pumped and she was given oxygen. The truth was, she had only taken 4 pills. For the most part, she was a victim of her own hysteria. She had considered killing herself, but decided to face Dr. Holland instead. In response to Dr. Holland's call, Dr. Vinus paid a visit to her clinic. He had a look at the anatine bottle with the puncture marks and decided to call the anesthesiologist, Dr. Bradley. After all, he was an important player in this scenario, having deducted that it was anatine that was causing all the medical emergencies and deaths among the children who were brought into Peterson Memorial. Tony Hall also got involved in this investigation. Together, they all searched Dr. Holland's clinic for data, paperwork, and anything else that would provide evidence of what was going on. Unexpectedly for Holland, there were 3 receipts and invoices for anatine, rather than the 2 she recalled. She had been unaware of a third bottle, which was still missing. The first two were signed for by Jones, but there was no signee for the third. After being discharged from Peterson Memorial, Janine returned to Dr. Holland's clinic. To her shock and horror, Texas Ranger Joe Davis was waiting for her. She was asked about the bottles of anatine. She told him she had no answers, but would gladly undergo a polygraph examination if Dr. Holland would do the same. Soon after, Dr. Holland arrived at the clinic. She approached Janine and informed her that due to her suicide attempt and allegations regarding the anatine and its effect on the patients, her services were no longer desired at the clinic. Janine broached the subject of her willingness to submit to a polygraph exam to demonstrate that she was innocent. Since delusion is an asset to the guilty party who believes they did nothing wrong, there was no point in running a polygraph. Janine became emotional as usual, swinging from a paroxysm of indignant rage to playing the victim card. But she finally left. The same day, Janine called Dr. Holland to tell her to look in a specific drawer. There, Dr. Holland found a suicide note written by Jones. This is the text from that note. There isn't any way to explain to you why things are going to change. Sometimes, as wrong as it may seem, you have to accept what life dishes out. When you're older, and I know you're tired of hearing that, but you will be able to understand why I have to go away. It doesn't mean I don't love you. Please believe that. No amount of money or worldly goods could ever buy my love. It is so deep and strong. It will last for all eternity. Please explain, if you can, to Heather and Michael how much I love them. It's such a strong love. I can't put it on paper. I know I'm asking a lot, but I really feel you're the only one could do it. I'm not guilty of murder, and I hope you believe that. But Daddy's way is right. It takes all the pressure off you and the 7 people whose life I have altered. No one can hurt me with my daddy. He'll straighten this whole thing out, and then we'll go home, and everything will be all right. No more problems for you. No more nightmares for me. Please make sure Michael and Heather are not separated. I know how my mother feels about Heather, but I also know how she feels about Michael. If Debbie or you can't take them together, please be sure whoever does are good people. People with lots of love. Please don't be angry. I'm going with Daddy because I miss him, and I want to be with him. He'll take care of both of us. You'll be fine. Please believe that. I love you. Janine. A few days later, Dr. Holland's hospital privileges at Peterson Memorial were suspended due to the nature of the investigation. She stayed in a hotel room as she could not return to the home she shared with Janine. A friend brought her there so she could collect some belongings and act as a buffer between Holland and Jones. She found a letter and some bottles of medication that Janine intended to use to frame Kathleen for malpractice. In the note, Janine said she failed the polygraph and hoped Kathleen would fail it too. Nevertheless, Janine vowed that she would take the blame for everything that had happened, but that she would also take Holland down with her. February 16th, 1983. Through the Texas media, the public found out that up to 60 children were murdered due to the actions of a single nurse. Genene Jones's name was mentioned as being culpable. She was listed as being the attending nurse for all the children who experienced medical emergencies and or deaths. Her overall mental health and inappropriate conduct was also cited as a factor in the hypothesis that she was unfit to perform in that role and possibly capable of deliberately harming and killing patients. A nurse named Kathy Ferguson had worked alongside Genene Jones at Holland's clinic. She recalled Jones injecting a patient with some kind of fluid, after which the patient experienced cardiac arrest and or respiratory distress. This she recalled as happening on at least 5 occasions. Janine was still living in the same house she shared with Kathleen Holland when Kathy Ferguson moved in. Soon after court proceedings began and Kathy was called to testify, her son suddenly had seizures one day, requiring a visit to the emergency room. The theory for this is that Janine injected her son with a drug as a means of punishing Kathy for testifying. April 1983. Bo Holmstedt was a doctor in Stockholm, Sweden, and he developed a way to detect the presence of drugs in an embalmed body. Chelsea McClelland was exhumed, and tissue samples were sent to Sweden. The test results revealed that she had received an overdose of anatine, which caused her heart attack and death. This was the first occasion during the investigation when a murder was confirmed to have been committed by Genene Jones. Kathy Ferguson ate a dinner that was prepared by Janine. Soon after digestion, she began having seizures. May 28, 1983. Genene Jones was indicted by a Kerr County grand jury for the murders of Chelsea McClelland, Brandy Benitez, Chris Parker, James Pearson, Misty Reichenau, Jacob Evans, and Rolinda Ruff. Bail was set at $225,000. Janine went on the lam. She married 19-year-old nurse's aide Garen Ray Turk so she could assume his surname as a means of eluding authorities, though she ended up living with friends in Odessa. Eventually, she was found and arrested. By the time November of 1983 rolled around, enough evidence was gathered to indict Jones for the intentional injury of Rolando Santos. Complicating the case was the admission by former Bexar officials that 4.5 tons of documents pertaining to the treatments, complications, and deaths of patients under Jones's care were destroyed. Speculation had it that the facility did so to avoid class action lawsuits. January 15th, 1984. The trial examining the role Genene Jones played in the deaths and intentional injuries of the patients began. The evidence verified her culpability. February 1984. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all charges. Jones was sentenced to 99 years in prison with the possibility of parole. October 1984. Genene Jones was found guilty in the death of Rolando Santos and was sentenced to 60 years with the possibility of parole. Though the parents and the public were pleased that Genene Jones was brought to justice for the crimes she had committed, there was a footnote of outrage that it took so long for investigators to stop Genene Jones before her unbridled campaign of injury and murder reached such shockingly gargantuan proportions. Genene Jones remains in prison to this day. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.